Linda Hirsch, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. By now, I'm sure most of you have heard about critical race theory, especially if you watch Fox News, where it seems to be a staple. Controversy over critical race theory, or CRT, rages as Republicans and conservatives rail against it as undermining American values and teaching us to hate each other. So what is this academic theory? Why is it engendering so much hostility? Why have 12 states banned even discussing it? Does it have anything to say that we should pay attention to? Today, I'm joined by two scholars and educators to discuss CRT, why it's been weaponized, and what students, both Black and white, need to know about race in America. Coming up now on EdCast.
Now, what is critical race theory? You know, just this week on Capitol Hill, I had a reporter run up to me. He thought he had a gotcha. He said, "Hey, what's critical race theory?" Apparently, he thought I would turn to him and say, "Gosh, I have no idea. I think it's really bad, but I just don't know what it is," because, conservatives are morons and we don't know what we're talking about. Like, he really did think this was such a, boy, he really got you there. And I explained to him, I said, well, it's a theory that derives from Marxism. Karl Marx viewed the entire world as a conflict between classes, between the owners of capital and the working man and women, the proletariat, a fundamental battle in society. Critical race theory takes that same Marxist concept, except it replaces class with race. And it says all of America and all of the world is a battle between the races. Critical race theory says every white person is a racist. Critical race theory says America is fundamentally racist and irredeemably racist. Critical race theory seeks to turn us against each other, and if someone has a different color skin, seeks to make us hate that person. And let me tell you right now, critical race theory is bigoted, it is a lie, and it is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets.
So the racial divide exists. And the question is, are we going to try to learn more about it in order to know how to think about it, how to intervene in it, how to fix it? Or are we just going to take it as a given with all of the stereotypes, all of the racism, cultural and otherwise, that are embedded in the existing system? So when the DeSantises of the world say, this teaches us to hate America, I say, no, this teaches us to see what America has been, to better understand how we can make America what we want it to be. Frankly, the ones that I think disdain America are the ones that think America is too fragile to confront what America has been.
Joining me today are two important scholars and educators. Ujju Aggarwal is an assistant professor of anthropology in the Schools of Public Engagement at the New School. She is co-editor of What's Race Got to Do with It? How Current School Reform Policy Maintains Racial and Economic Inequality. She also brings a long history of working to build local and national organizations that work for educational justice, immigrants' rights, and transformative justice. Brian Jones is an alumnus of City College and the CUNY Graduate Center, where he earned a PhD in urban education. A teacher for 9 years, he is a former Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture and is the founding director of the New York Public Library Center for Educators and Schools. Thank you both so much for joining me today on EdCast. We opened up with a clip of Ted Cruz denouncing critical race theory, claiming that it is every bit as racist as Klansmen in white sheets, and a brief clip of Kimberly Crenshaw, I believe the originator of the term critical race theory, discussing why we need the lens that it provides. So Ujju, I'd like to begin with you. What is critical race theory?
Sure, and thank you so much for inviting me, and really excited to be in conversation with you all and with Brian. And Brian, please add on also as helpful. So I'll provide just a kind of very cursory overview of critical race theory. Is a school of thought that emerges in the late 1970s and early 1980s among legal scholars It's grounded in a clear understanding that if the US is founded on genocide and slavery, then those foundations are interwoven with capitalism and dominant ideas of freedom and equality, such as meritocracy and other ideas that, that are central and important to the United States. One of the key things that we can understand critical race theory as doing is helping us see how racism shapes the law and how the law ensures and continues to shape or reproduce structures of racism and racialized inequality. Note is that critical race studies grows out of critical legal studies, which also emphasizes that the law is not neutral or objective and cannot be separated from the political, social, or economic context in which it was constructed. That is, that the law can be used to maintain and codify and reproduce a given social order and is not separate from inequality, but embedded within it. One of the additional kind of components that CRT critical race theory adds to this mix is the significance, central significance of race and racism, and also the provocation and the need to transform structures of inequality.
Brian, is there anything you'd want to add to that, or pretty comprehensive? I guess, I think what, in its simplest way, I suppose, is it correct to say that critical race theory is saying it's not the individual racist, but that it is embedded, it's a systemic condition, so to speak.
I think one of the key things is that critical race theory helps us see that racism is not reformable, right? That reform doesn't work, nor does incremental change. That just as you said, Linda, we need structural change, right? We need to address the structures, not the individuals. And we can't look to tweak a system, right? But it helps us see actually the work that reform does within the law to maintain and reproduce inequality and racialized inequality.
So why do you think it's under attack right now?
Well, I think a big, well, first of all, it's being named right now because it's a convenient scapegoat and a kind of flag to wave for the right wing. But it's the actual taking away the term critical race theory, the teaching of a deeper, more complicated and contradictory history of this country has always been under attack and is actually something that people have fought for and advocated for and had to do in secret or outside of formal school settings for a long time. I'm more familiar with Black studies and Black scholarship, which has been basically ignored in the academy and denigrated for a very long time. And only recently, posthumously, do folks like W.E.B. Du Bois even begin to get their due for the ways that they help us rethink and reframe US history. One thing I want to pick up on that Ujju mentioned about the definition of critical race theory. And, to prepare for this conversation, I went back to the first critical race theory anthology that they published. Just, let me read some actual critical race theory, just get my head around it for 5 seconds. And it's really nothing like what Ted Cruz describes. Like, he's like, oh, they got me. They thought it was a gotcha because I haven't read anything, but I know what it is. And then he launches into a thing that has nothing to do with it. It's interesting. But what they're actually concerned, first of all, it's not just Black scholars and scholars of color. It's a multiracial group of scholars publishing together. They admit that they actually don't all agree with each other about everything, but that they've common concerns. And I think, and Jelani Cobb has a piece in the New Yorker that just came out today or yesterday about the kind of origins, about Derek Bell's work, the legal scholar Derek Bell, and the origin story of critical race theory that is useful. So reading that and beginning to read the introduction of this anthology, what comes to the fore in my mind is a group of scholars who were rooted in and thinking about the civil rights movement victories, which were victories, especially in the courts. But then their experience, as the decades go on after those legal victories, the experience looking around is that the old inequalities seem to be reasserting themselves, particularly in terms of racism, again and again, and in so many different ways. And that's why somebody like Derek Bell begins to say, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't just a failing of the system, maybe this is the system.
Mm.
And that's why these critical race theorists begin to ask the question, why does this keep re-emerging? And the thing that you said, Ujju, is actually said very plainly in the introduction to the anthology, I can accurately state, which is that their political commitment is to do this scholarship in order to change it, to intervene in the system to change it. So actually their claim is not that this is an eternal state of affairs, or this is the way it always is. All white people are racist. Like here, we're gonna like lock everybody in a category and here's the state of affairs that really obtains. Although there is a debate among them about how hard it would be to change it and how deep the change goes and what will be required to create this change. There is a commitment to trying to change these matters. And so there's a real emphasis. In some ways, maybe it's misnamed. I mean, in some ways it's not, the emphasis is not on race itself as the category, but more on racism, it seems like.
What have been some of your own personal experiences? I know, Brian, you were a teacher for 9 years and you write about some of those experiences. Tell us a little bit about what you experienced firsthand.
Well, what I experienced firsthand was I taught in New York City public schools, elementary school for 9 years. And I was always struck by the way that parents and students and my colleagues were like, just, I don't know, came to school with so much hope and with so much optimism. And like, we're recording this on the first day of a new school year, and you just kind of never forget that feeling. And today also, my two kids went to their first day of school. School is a place that people invest a lot of hope. And it's a very hopeful place. And right when I was beginning my classroom career was the time when there was this incredible wave of privatization. And the privatization really tried to pull the rug out from under public education in a way that Ujju and others have written about so passionately and fought against and organized against so passionately and eloquently. But what was most interesting to me, or among the things that was interesting to me about that, was the way in which that push for privatization also wrapped itself in the robes of racial justice and said that that's what it was after. And there's an element of that in play here too, where the right wing claims that they are the anti-racist. They're the ones who are sniffing out a new racism, and it's called critical race theory, and it's just as bad as the Klan. And so they don't want people teaching racism in the schools. I mean, it's the same kind of disingenuous anti-racism at work.
Ujju, you have an edited volume. What's race got to do with it? How current school reform policy maintains racial and economic inequality. And in that volume, you present a view of school reform as actually harming students of color. Why is this so?
Well, yeah, so it's a volume that I co-edited with Edwin Mayorga and Bree Pickauer, that Brian actually has a wonderful piece in that I learned so much. What is happening when the language of civil rights is being used to unfurl material reforms and structural changes that we know do not serve or advance the well-being of poor and working class communities of color, and rather do the opposite, right? So how do we think about those types of contradictions? And the first volume, which actually Bree and Edwin edited, I just came on as an editor, co-editor for the second volume, emerges again out of these growing conversations that took shape among not just in the academy, but among a lot of people just working on the ground, trying to think through, again, the context that Brian just laid out. What does it mean that that privatization was advancing and yet claiming this language, again, of civil rights? In my own work, I look at the problem of school choice, and that kind of focus grows out of organizing that I was involved with for a number of years with others through the Center for Immigrant Families and the Parent Leadership Project in New York City, thinking about another contradiction, right? Which was the organizing that we engaged in was not necessarily around privatization or charter schools, but was around school choice, and we confronted a minority kind of block of parents in our school district in which they were kind of liberal, progressive parents with economic capital on their side, right? Who were staunchly against kind of the privatization of education that charter schools represented, but very invested in defending the policies of school choice from which they benefited.
When we listen to Ted Cruz and the right-wing conservatives, their big concern is what's happening in the classroom. CRT is a very bad thing. It's not even really taught in the classroom. Maybe we should talk about that too. But this is begging the whole question again about what should be taught in American classrooms regarding American history and racism in our country. And I'd like to ask both of you, what do students need to know? And how do we, I know there are teachers out there, how do we have these conversations? They are difficult to have. So what do we need to make sure we get across? And how do we get that across?
Well, okay, that's a huge question. Every generation asks new questions about the past and about history. That's the way history goes. History is just a series of stories that we tell about the past. And hopefully we are open-minded enough to be surprised by really investigating that history and the things that we may find there. But I think this current push is about trying to stop this new generation from asking those questions. So what should we teach and how should we teach it? There's so much to cover. You can't pin down and say, here are the 3 things we absolutely have to teach. But I think we do better when we move towards a more inquiry-based approach to these questions, allowing the questions to exist in the classroom, allowing this new generation to ask what they're wondering about. And being led by those new questions will take us very far, because they're not only wondering about Black history and the history of enslavement and Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow and all of that. They're also asking about what happened to the indigenous population here and everywhere. They're asking about gender and about the gender categories that they've received. And to your question about capitalism, they're also asking about that. Sometimes I think the way these things work is that they're very powerful when they're not named. It's like once you even say the word out loud, capitalism, and it becomes an object of study, that's a problem. And part of the power of capitalism is to never name it and keep it off the table. The same thing could be true with race and racism. Not naming them and not talking about them, which is what the right wing is saying we should do in our classrooms, it should not be mentioned, does not actually help us understand them. And there's tremendous power. And once you put it on the table as an object of study, then I think there's people who are afraid of where that study will go. But those of us who are unafraid of that, that doesn't mean we necessarily know all of the answers or to all of the questions or where all of the investigations will lead or what students, I also don't think we need to say in advance what students should take away. Should this study make students proud of the country or should it make them ashamed of the country? Or some mixture of the two. I don't think we should establish those things in advance.
But I think what, Brian, you're kind of pointing to is so important. And I just want to kind of build on it in a couple quick ways. One is to think about kind of this. One of the things that critical race theory teaches us to do is look beyond the immediate flashpoint, right? And so how do we also locate this within a particular conjuncture and a long history, right? The long history that you kind of note, Brian, of what people have done to forge education as a tool for freedom, right? But then also the long-standing attacks, right? There was recently a piece in The Nation by Jasmine Banks talking about and kind of illuminating how the Koch network has been embedded for a very long time in the production of this manufactured crisis around critical race theory and around this kind of whatever Ted Cruz was talking about when he was referencing it, which are a lot of, just untrue things. But how, for example, they, along with kind of their network of the Heritage Foundation and ALEC, have produced over 80 articles and podcasts in 1 year alone, right? So this is, again, kind of planned. It's also emerging at the conjuncture that Brian mentions, a time when there's massive uprising around racial justice, right? Around young people are making links. More young people today are in favor of socialism than ever before. And at a time when there has been massive, massive movements for educational justice growing across the country, right? So there's wildcat strikes, but like we haven't seen in recent history. And so we have to think about kind of what is this crisis really mobilizing around, right? At a time when education, public education, is also in crisis like it has never been before, right? Last year, there has, just in the last year alone, urban school districts saw 3 to 4% reduction in their enrollments, right? We don't know where kind of the question of public education is going to go to. And with this kind of fervor of, you don't know what's going to happen to your child when they go into a classroom, what they're going to be taught, and with the infrastructure that has been created, right, and strengthened by the Trump 2017 tax reform, right, that created increased mechanisms to erode public education, we then have to think about what is happening.
We have children coming into our schools with completely different experiences. They're not all together. We have white children, Black children, from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, and yet our public schools are supposed to be the equalizers in some sense. So the inquiry, the questions that we want students asking, some of them are coming to us very young. So I'm thinking of something like the 1619 Project that the New York Times has been advocating, that also has been very much put down by conservatives. What do you think of a curriculum like that? Is that a good lens to look through? Is the lens of slavery in American history one that is that a useful one? What do you think should happen in our lower school classrooms? Are these classroom conversations about race as divisive as critics say? And how can we make them not as divisive?
Well, yeah, maybe I can't vouch for every teacher's approach. Certainly, like anything, there are better and worse ways to approach a topic, like any topic. But if somebody does it badly, that doesn't mean that therefore we should scrap the effort. Students, everybody can see inequality. From a very young age, students start asking questions about their world. As an former elementary school teacher, I was always trained that the technique we should use to help students understand their world is to notice and name. We notice and name things. And if big things are happening, like inequality, racism, and other forms of structural violence, and we don't help students notice and name them in the classroom, then the message we're sending is that the things that you're experiencing and seeing are not worthy of our study and attention. They're not worthy of taking our time here to try to understand them more deeply. The scholars whom I follow and admire their work the most actually put the emphasis on racism more than on race. That is, they're not interested in locking people into identity categories, but rather they begin from the premise that the categories are constructed and created. And the real problem is the way that our society has used these categories to treat people badly. And I think even at a young age, people have a sense of questions of fairness. And that's really some of the fundamental things. I wouldn't, as an elementary school teacher, want to try to lock kids into an identity, say you are this and you are that, but rather let's look at what we see happening in our world and try to understand, excuse me, unfortunately, some of the bad things that you see, some of the ways that people are mistreated. If you see that, but we can't talk about it, then what's the purpose of school?
And Ujju,
yeah, I mean, I think it's such an important question. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you laid out, Brian. And I think also kind of, we can't assume, I think it's just unfair to imagine that young people are not thinking about the conditions around them, right? Are not thinking about the world that is unfolding around them. So even in the case of preschoolers, right? I've worked for a long time with a Head Start center, and there were, I mean, children, young children, pre-K 3 and 4, right, are thinking about what is happening with the police, right, in my neighborhood? What is happening? Why is my mom stressed out around X, Y, and Z, right? So if we can give some tools of inquiry and naming, as Brian says, I think the other thing is to not imagine that, I mean, one of the things that critical race theory teaches us is that education is not neutral. If it is to be transformative, it will not be comfortable, right? I think if we can, any of us can think about transformative experiences in our lives, they haven't been comfortable experiences, but they have been meaningful ones, right? So I think then the question then is also, how do we really center transformative educational experiences? And also, as Brian said, critical race theory is against, right, the idea that there's individual bad apples, right? It's not about teaching about kind of, oh, this person was so bad, but rather about understanding that individual is embedded in structures and systems that they were invested in protecting and implicated in, right? So again, so I think those are some of the ways that we can think about this. And, the education studies scholar Lee Patel recently said that something that I thought was helpful, that my own dad just kind of repeated in a offhand conversation around, well, what is this critical race theory stuff, right? Where she said something basically like, the win here, we need to keep our eyes on the prize, so to speak. And the win is not having a revisionist version of history, right? But really having accurate history and having that and kind of telling kind of the truths that, Brian, you were referencing, kind of Black studies and Black freedom struggles kind of center the study, right? In terms of the curriculum in our schools, right? How do we win that and not just be called revisionists, right? But how do we kind of make that, again, as you're saying, Linda, kind of the center, right, of what we're teaching and learning in the schools?
We come out of time. I just want to add quickly then, what you say about CRT, again, not emphasizing the individual, if you could tell me briefly, would that mean that anti-bias training is not really effective, that anti-bias training looks more toward the individual than it does toward the system? So do you have any thoughts about anti-bias training for teachers, parents?
I co-wrote a piece about the New York City Department of Education's initial attempt at anti-bias training for Chalkbeat. I co-wrote a piece with Anthony Erickson and Adam Sanchez, arguing that it does need a strong historical lens. Otherwise, the danger is of falling into that trap that you describe, the kind of purely individual lens. I will say, though, that teaching is a really complicated act that requires thousands of decisions by individuals, often working in a lot of isolation from each other. And, bias is a real thing. So figuring out how to disentangle that is not easy. But in all cases, I definitely support having greater historical knowledge. And I know that if I had been equipped with greater knowledge of even the schools in which I was teaching and the history of the way the students and their parents had tried to shape and fight for those schools, in the buildings where I was standing, but I was ignorant of that background, that I think that would have done a lot to change the way I approached students and their families as a teacher.
Thank you both so much. We are completely out of time. So this has been such an important conversation. I hope you feel we got to discuss some of the key concepts here. You both were so enlightened and informative, enlightening. So I thank you both so much. Ujju Aggarwal, Brian Jones, for joining us today on EdCast. That's it for this edition of EdCast. Welcome back to a new season and a new school year. We look forward to seeing you next time.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your thoughts and comments to cunyedcast@gmail.com.